Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into the truly bizarre world of medieval entertainment. Yes, that's a real sentence. Imagine a field somewhere outside a 13th century town. It's muddy, smells faintly of livestock and burnt onions, and there in the middle of it all is a bear wearing a tiny cap, dancing on its hind legs to the sound of a lute played by a man with no shoes and one eyebrow. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where fun had sharp teeth, fleas, and probably rabies. You might think your Netflix queue or weekend brunch plans are simple pleasures, but in medieval times the bar was subterranean. Whether it was watching animal acts, staging ridiculous performances, or laughing at absurd puppet shows, the people of this era didn't need CGI. They just needed something with fur and a catchy tune. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive a week here without at least 3 tetanus shots. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle into the village square where something's happening. There's music, a crowd, and a small dog riding on the back of a pig. Welcome to the Menagerie of Marvels, otherwise known as a travelling performers roadshow. In medieval Europe, these troops of entertainers moved from village to village, bringing with them acrobats, jesters, singers, and most curiously, dancing animals. A bear, muzzled and chained, stands on 2 legs and sways in jerky rhythm to the beat of a tambourine. Is it dancing or just trying not to fall over? Doesn't matter, the crowd cheers. Dancing bears were shockingly common forms of entertainment from the early Middle Ages into the 17th century. Trainers, often Romani or itinerant performers, used crude methods, often involving hot plates or beating to get the animals to dance. It was part cruelty, part showbiz, and weirdly, a favourite among both children and nobility. Nearby, you might catch sight of a frog balletno really. Tiny frogs, tied delicately at the leg with a thread, were trained, well, sort of, to hop in a synchronized circle on a small rotating wooden platform. Historians still argue whether these strange little performances were more prank than art, but the medieval audience ate it up. One chronicler in the Burgundian court even noted a performance where frogs were clad in velvet slippers, which, if true, sounds like the strangest Etsy shop ever. Animal cruelty laws were, not a thing, so training involved lots of sticks, heat, and general unpleasantness. But for the crowd, it was magical. You hear clapping, oohs and ahs, and someone even tosses a coin onto the stage, a piece of silver for the frog that does a somersault. There's a juggler now, except instead of clubs, he's juggling live ferrets. The crowd goes wild when one bites his hand. A local brewer bursts into laughter, then promptly spills half his tankard of ale on a nearby priest. Everyone howls. No one's quite sure what's more fun, the actual performance or the unpredictable chaos that comes with it. Mainstream historians agree that this type of roving entertainment played a vital role in the social fabric of medieval towns. With few fixed theatres and limited literacy, performance was how stories were shared and joy was distributed, often along with fleas. And because townspeople rarely travelled far from their birthplace, the arrival of one of these shows was like the Super Bowl, a TikTok trend, and a family reunion all rolled into one. The vibe wasn't just laughter though. Sometimes these shows turned unsettling. Imagine a monkey in a tiny suit mimicking human behaviour, or a performer swallowing live snakes for applause. Medieval audiences walked a strange line between delight and discomfort. They were entertained by what made them squirm. And if animal acts didn't do it for you, you could stick around for the night show, a masked mime troupe, performing the story of Noah's Ark using only barnyard sounds and a goat in a papier-mâché boat. Was it weird? Deeply. Did people love it? Without question. Of course, these events weren't without critics. Monks and scholars often complained that such amusements led the faithful away from God. One abbot wrote that the devil dances in the bear's shadow. Others believed the performances carried pagan influence, especially when performers invoked ancient spirits or performed in costumes resembling forest deities. Still, the crowds kept coming because even in a world full of toil, disease, and superstition, people still needed to laugh. The strangest thing is, you feel that same flicker of joy now, watching something so ridiculous and out of place that you can't help but giggle. Maybe it's the sheer absurdity of it all, The fact that someone trained a rooster to play dead on command, or that a crowd of adults has gathered to chant for a frog to jump through a hoop. Just as the performance ends and the crowd begins to thin, a boy runs past holding a rat tied to a tiny cart. Behind him, his sister pretends to be a rat queen, handing out imaginary coins. And that's the thing about medieval entertainment, it didn't need production value. Just imagination, mischief, and maybe a goat who knows how to bow. You wake up with a slight headache, a dry throat, and someone's wooden shoe stuck under your back. That's right, you fell asleep behind a hay cart after last night's frog ballet. But the town square is already stirring again, and today's entertainment promises something far more chaotic. Picture this: grown men in armor, tipsy on mead, charging each other across a muddy field, not for glory, not for honor, but to win a bet about who can stay upright on a rolling barrel the longest. Welcome to the wildly ridiculous world of drunken jousts. Now, you've probably heard of real jousting, those high stakes, lance-wielding duels between noble knights, galloping full speed in grand tournaments. Yes, that's real. It happened. And it was dramatic, dangerous, and often politically significant. But there was also this other kind of joust. The kind that happened in back alleys, tavern fields, or village greens, where the only armor was a dented cooking pot, and your opponent was too hammered to tell which end of the lance was up. Mock tournaments were popular in medieval times, especially during festivals. Villagers, squires, and even bored young nobles would dress up, arm themselves with broom handles, and create absurd challenges. One such game involved sitting on wheeled carts, basically medieval office chair sand, jousting each other across a courtyard. The winner got ale, the loser got a sprained ankle, and likely, a chicken feather in the eye. A famous example comes from a 14th century French town where two rival bakers settled a pricing dispute by organizing a makeshift joust using cabbages instead of lances. The town's mayor reportedly declared it a show of gentlemanly disgrace. The crowd declared it hilarious. Historians still argue whether these mock jousts were purely comedic or served some subtle function of social leveling. Some believe they offered a way for the lower classes to parody the elite, imagine getting to cosplay a noble knight and fight in the same way they did, even if your sword was actually a sausage on a stick. These drunken tournaments often coincided with feast days, harvest festivals, or weddings times when people were already tipsy and logic was on vacation. Contests could include pig chasing, bonus points if the pig was greased, climbing oiled poles to retrieve a prize, and trying to wrestle a rooster while blindfolded. Again, entertainment standards were different when your alternatives were plague or another sermon. You find yourself at the edge of today's event, watching two men attempting to joust using long sticks and bread rolls as shields. One stumbles immediately and lands in a horse trough. The crowd roars. Someone hands you a turnip to throw at the winner. You decline. Another person hands you mead. You do not decline. And of course, there were judges. Not official ones, mind you, just loud town elders or self-appointed referees who banged pots when someone broke an imaginary rule. One man in particular wears a ceremonial cabbage on his head. He takes his duties very seriously. It wasn't all madness. There was rhythm to it, ritual, a kind of absurd dignity. People believed that laughter, especially during times of hardship, had spiritual power. Some thought it could ward off evil spirits or bring good fortune to a harvest. There's even record of a village in Bavaria where annual drunken duels were blessed by the local priest, as long as nobody died, of course. And yes, people did get hurt. Arms were broken, teeth were lost, but injuries were often worn as badges of honor, proof that you'd participated in the feud even if you couldn't remember it. The most extravagant version of the mock tournament happened during carnival seasons. These were extended festivals where all social order turned upside down. Drunken jousts became the centerpiece. Nobles pretended to be beggars. Bakers rode donkeys dressed like war horses. And the local blacksmith? He hosted an Iron Man competition where people had to carry anvils across a mud pit. One weird variant? Snail jousting. We kid you not. In some 15th century writings, townsfolk used toy snails on wheels, dressed them in painted shells, and raced them across tables while placing bets. It was a parody of the noble tournament, a little joke at the expense of tradition, and people loved it. Even today, Traces of these drunken medieval sports linger in European festivals like cheese rolling in England or Krampus runs in Austria. Modern health codes might not allow full-contact cabbage jousts anymore, but the spirit survives. As the last fake knight gets hauled away by two giggling farmhands, his armor clanging like an overstuffed pantry, you realize something important. These weren't just people being silly. They were building bonshed laughter in a world full of fear, hunger, and uncertainty. Because sometimes, surviving another week of feudal life deserved a toast, and maybe a broom handle to the ribs. You barely have time to recover from the image of a tipsy man jousting with a loaf of bread before the next event sweeps through the village like a particularly aggressive rooster. You hear hooves pounding, people cheering, and wait is that a goose hanging upside down from a rope? Oh yes, it is time for goose pulling. This was, without exaggeration, one of the more absurd and honestly alarming sports of the medieval world. Picture this. A live goose is suspended upside down from a string stretched across a road. Riders, usually young men on horseback, charge at full gallop toward it. The goal? Grab the goose by the neck and pull it free in one clean yank. If you succeed, you get to keep the goose. If you fail, well, you either tumble off your horse or wrench your shoulder trying. And yes, the goose usually died in the process. Welcome to medieval party games, where animal welfare took a permanent vacation. While this seems cartoonishly cruel to modern eyes, it was viewed as a test of skill and strength. You needed a strong grip, precise timing, and nerves of steel because a goose is surprisingly fierce when suspended upside down. They flail, they bite, sometimes they scream, and they do not go quietly. Goose pulling was especially popular in parts of Spain, France, and the Low Countries. In some regions, they upped the ante by greasing the goose's neck. Yes, greasing it. Now you're charging at a flailing, honking, soap-covered goose while the crowd screams encouragement and throws old fruit at anyone who misses. Historians still argue whether this sport was ever meant to be symbolic. Was it a metaphor for battle, for fertility, or was it just people being really, really bored? And it wasn't limited to geese. In some towns, they used ducks, or cats. One infamous record from 14th century Belgium references a short-lived tradition called eel riding, which, mercifully, didn't last long and remains mostly unexplained. All we know is that someone tried it, someone regretted it, and it was never spoken of again. You stand in the village green as today's goose-pulling competition kicks off. The bird, surprisingly calm, hangs like a feathery pendulum as riders line up. One man adjusts his tunic like he's about to duel a dragon. Another flexes dramatically. A third is already drunk. The starter bell rings. Well, it's more of a pot lid being smacked, and the first rider gallops forward. He reaches, misses, and keeps going straight into a haystack. The crowd roars with laughter. Someone yells, "Next!" and another rider charges. This one gets a good grip, but loses it at the last second, yanking only a few feathers free. The goose is, at this point, reconsidering all its life choices. Finally, a wiry young man with one eye and no shoes takes his turn. He leans low, snatches the goose clean off the rope, and hoists it triumphantly overhead like a weird, flapping trophy. He is declared the Goose King of the day. He receives 2 turnips, a flagon of beer, and a kiss from the baker's daughter, who looks less than thrilled. Everyone cheers. The village priest mutters something about sin but drinks his mead anyway. There were, believe it or not, rules to this madness. Some regions outlawed harming the goose ahead of time. Others insisted it must be properly enraged. In Spain, during certain festivals, the bird was already dead before being hung. But in Northern Europe, a live bird was considered essential. The cruelty was part of the spectacle, part of the challenge. Brutal? Absolutely. But strangely normalized in an era when butchering your own dinner was a daily reality. Modern historians try to make sense of it. Some argue goose pulling began as a fertility ritual, symbolizing masculine prowess and dominance. Others see it as military training disguised as festivity. Still others say, no, this was just peak medieval nonsense. People liked feathers, fast horses, and shouting. Put those together and you get this. If it helps, some festivals replaced the goose with a sack of flour or a puppet in later centuries. But in its heyday, goose pulling was the highlight of a celebration. There were songs, costumes, and prizes. In some towns, the The winner led a parade through the streets, goose in hand like a strange medieval Oscar statuette. You catch your breath as the crowd begins to drift. The Goose King is already trying to trade his bird for a meat pie. Children chase each other with loose feathers. An old woman sells tiny wooden goose charms that she swears bring good luck, though you're not convinced. There's mud on your shoes, laughter in the air, and a strong smell of wet poultry. As strange as it sounds, you're starting to understand. In a world with little comfort, little control, and almost no privacy, these chaotic moments gave people a sense of celebration, a day to laugh, shout, and chase something ridiculous on horseback. And somewhere, deep in the tangled weeds of medieval psychology, that might have made perfect sense. The afternoon sun begins to dip just slightly, casting long, slanted shadows across the village square, but there's no quieting of the crowd. In fact, more people are gathering now, crowding in with their families, their food baskets, and their best cloaks, because tonight's entertainment is something no one dares miss: a public execution. That's right, executions in medieval times weren't just grim judicial affairs, they were community events, major ones. In some towns they were the most anticipated spectacle of the season, drawing people from miles around. And while today you'd rather avoid such a macabre occasion, here in the Middle Ages, you join the throng with morbid curiosity, because this is where the weirdness of entertainment takes a very dark turn. The scaffold is set up near the town gate. It's rough timber, built in haste but meant to hold firm. A man in a dark hood paces back and forth, sharpening his axe on a whetstone. You hear whispers that he's new at this, oh good. Nothing says, relaxing evening, like amateur decapitation. Crowds have brought blankets, bread, apples, cheese. Children run around playing tag. Someone even set up a meat pie stall. It feels disturbingly like a fairground, complete with music, food, and excited gossip. People don't just come for the punishment, they come for the drama. Who cried, who fainted, who confessed at the last minute. Every execution is a social narrative in the making. Mainstream historical records show that medieval executions were public for a reason: deterrence. Authorities wanted everyone to see what happened when you defied the law or the crown. But over time, this grim necessity morphed into something else, something theatrical. People wanted a show, and hangings, burnings, or beheadings delivered. In many cases, execution days were marked on local calendars with a quiet enthusiasm. You overhear someone say they got up before dawn just to get a good spot. Others argue over whether the accused will say anything heroic before the end. Last words are everything, one woman says, sipping wine. He better deliver. And you begin to understand that this isn't really about justice anymore. It's about the performance. In some towns, these events included musicians playing dirges, poets composing verses about the condemned, or actors reenacting the crime. Yes, actors. In parts of Italy and France, small troupes would perform morality plays based on the criminal's deeds just before the hanging, turning the execution into a literal theatre of sin and consequence. Imagine being sentenced to death, and watching someone in tights perform your downfall with a wooden sword and exaggerated sneers. But even more bizarre were the commemorative souvenirs. That's right, people bought tokens, bits of the rope, wood shavings from the gallows, even drops of blood when they could sneak them. It was believed by some that these items held magical properties, either to ward off evil or bring justice to their owners. Historians still argue whether this was more religious in nature or a kind of folk magic gone commercial. Today's condemned man is a thief. Nothing too grand he stole from the bishop's cellar and insulted a guard. But he's a local, which makes it personal. As he's dragged onto the scaffold, the murmuring quiets slightly. Everyone leans in. His face is pale but defiant. He looks out over the crowd and opens his mouth. You expect a final plea, a whispered prayer, maybe even a poetic quote. Instead, he burps loudly and says, "Save me some pie." The crowd erupts in laughter. A few cheer. One woman actually claps. And just like that, the tone of the execution changes from solemn to satirical. The executioner fumbles with the rope, clearly sweating under his hood. Someone starts a chant. "Cut the rope! Cut the rope!" Another yells. A man in the back is taking bets on whether the first swing will work. You slowly begin to realize that this isn't about the crime, or the punishment, or even the man. It's about participation. Everyone here feels part of the event. And somehow, In the twisted logic of the Middle Ages, that makes it fun. Executions weren't always violent. Some were symbolic. In rare cases, especially involving nobility, a person might be executed in effigy straw dummy dressed in their clothes, burned or hanged in their place while they watched from exile. Other times, criminals were sentenced to shaming being paraded through town in a cart, while people hurled rotten food or shouted insults. It was still public, still theatrical, and still weirdly popular. Occasionally, things got out of hand. There are records of crowds rioting when an execution was cancelled or delayed. Once, in 15th century London, a hangman slipped and accidentally injured himself before the act. The crowd grew so restless that town guards had to stage a mock execution just to calm them down. They pretended to hang a sack filled with vegetables while someone in the crowd made death sounds. People actually cheered. As the final moment approaches today, the man kneels. The executioner, likely praying no one notices his trembling hands, tightens the noose. A bell tolls. The crowd holds its breath, then silence. And when it's done, people start clapping. A few weep. Others yawn. A child asks if they can have a turn on the platform. You step back, stunned at the casual acceptance, the way people instantly return to their pies and gossip. And while a part of you wants to scream, another part understands. In a world where life was brutal and short, where death visited often and rarely gently, this was how people coped with ritual, with participation, and, disturbingly, with cheer. By nightfall the square is empty again, the scaffold taken down. Only a few muddy prints and a half-eaten apple remain. You walk away, quietly unsettled but no longer surprised. Because by now you've learned a strange truth. In medieval times, even death could be repackaged as entertainment. Not out of cruelty always, but from a desperate need to feel something to make meaning out of chaos. And if that meant turning justice into a town picnic, well, pass the cheese. The following morning brings something a little less deadly, but no less disturbing. The village square has been cleared of gallows and guillotines, and in its place sits a table covered in ceramic bowls, linens, and several very sharp, very shiny lancets. You take a step closer, and a cheerful man with ruddy cheeks and suspiciously stained sleeves announces the day's next entertainment, a bloodletting party. Yes, you heard that correctly. People in medieval times often gathered to be voluntarily drained of their blood, sometimes for health, sometimes for spiritual purification, and sometimes, unbelievably, just for the sheer novelty of it. While you're sipping your morning gruel and trying to make sense of things, a line has already formed. This isn't a punishment, it's a social event. You watch as the first Pacentan, elderly woman, wrapped in a modest, cloak sits calmly on a wooden bench. The barber surgeon, dressed in faded red and brown stripes, expertly ties a cloth above her elbow, finds a vein, and makes a quick incision. Blood flows smoothly into a small basin. The woman doesn't flinch. In fact, she smiles. Around her, neighbors nod approvingly, some even applauding. You try not to pass out. It's important to understand that bloodletting wasn't seen as a horrifying ordeal. It was considered a healthy practice rooted in the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When those humours got out of balance, too much blood, say, making you feverish or aggressive, then out came the lancet. This idea, originally from Greco-Roman medicine, was absorbed into medieval science, and from there, into everyday life. People didn't just accept it, they made events out of it. In some towns, these events were almost ceremonial. Families would come together once a season to have their blood let, like changing the oil in a wagon. They'd eat light meals beforehand, wear clean garments, and speak softly, almost reverently. And afterwards, they'd relax with weak wine, bread, and sometimes soft music played on a lute or rebec. One 14th century monk even referred to it as cleansing of both body and temper. Historians still argue whether some people understood the real physiological effects of blood loss or simply followed the rituals out of custom. In either case, the practice flourished. Even popes and kings regularly underwent bloodletting, with royal surgeons keeping detailed records of how many ounces were drawn. Charlemagne reportedly had it done 4 times a year like clockwork. You move down the line and overhear a conversation between 2 young men debating which method is more effective, cupping or leeching. One insists on the mechanical precision of steel. The other swears by leeches, holding up a small jar with several already squirming inside. They're gentler, he claims, and you can name them. There's even competitive bragging. I gave 6 ounces last month, one man boasts. Didn't even blink. Another scoffs. 8 ounces. Didn't sit down after. The first man narrows his eyes. It's the medieval version of who can lift more at the gym. Leech-based bloodletting was especially common among the upper classes. The leeches, often imported from far-off swamps, were expensive and finicky. They were kept in jars lined with moss and fed carefully. Some noble households had their own leech keeper, whose job it was to maintain these little wriggling surgeons. And just like that, you realize you live in a world where someone's job was literally to babysit blood-sucking worms. The fringe detail today? A man dressed like a jester strolls around offering mock leeching. He holds a wooden spoon, tells you it's enchanted, and dramatically touches people's foreheads while chanting nonsense. They giggle, tip him a coin, and call it the safe version. It's ridiculous, and honestly kind of wholesome. In one corner, a barber surgeon has set up an artistic display of his tools rows of gleaming blades, copper bowls, and ornate jars of herbs. There's even a tiny sign that says, "Ask about our seasonal bleeding packages." You begin to suspect that someone's found a marketing niche in the art of medieval draining. The practice extended beyond people. Animals were bled too. Sick oxen, anxious dogs, even the occasional pampered cattle considered candidates for rebalancing. In one 15th century manuscript, a noblewoman wrote about having her pet squirrel bled to improve its restless nature. The squirrel died. She blamed the barber. As with all things medieval, religion and superstition also played their part. Bloodletting was often timed according to moon phases. Calendars marked favourable days for certain limbs, right arm on Tuesday, left foot on Friday, that sort of thing. Some physicians carried detailed bleeding charts that looked like celestial maps. In rare cases, people even believed the released blood could carry away sins or bad dreams. Today's gathering wraps up with a communal resting hour. Patients lie back on straw mats under the trees, sipping broth while soft music drifts from a flutist seated atop a barrel. It feels less like a medical procedure and more like an unplugged folk concert at a wellness spa. The contrast between the blood and the peace is oddly calming. As you sit down to observe, an older man beside you tells a story of how his grandfather was cured of terrible headaches by letting blood from his temple. He pantomimes the process with great flair, describing the sudden relief as if it were divine intervention. You smile politely, wondering how many people simply passed out and woke up thinking they'd been cured. One final note. Not all bloodletting was peaceful. In plague years, desperate crowds begged to be drained, hoping it would stop the infection. In times of panic, barbers were overwhelmed, their tools reused hastily, infection spreading faster than it could be treated. What was once festive turned frantic. In those moments, the cheerful ritual lost its charm, revealing how fragile the line was between tradition and terror. But today, no panic hangs in the air. Just content villagers wiping spots of red from their wrists, making plans for supper, and debating whether next month's bleeding should include song or not. You never thought you'd witness this many people happily parting with their blood, but here you are, slightly queasy, fully fascinated, and almost tempted to try the mock leech spoon experience yourself. You walk away slowly, the image of copper bowls and linen-wrapped arms etched into your mind. It's strange, isn't it? In a world where sickness lurked behind every cough, people still manage to find rhythm, community, and even a touch of delight in the very rituals meant to heal them. Whether it worked or not, well, historians are still bleeding that mystery dry. As evening edges in again, the tone of the village changes. The riotous humour of bloodletting has given way to something darker, quieter, yet still strangely magnetic. Lanterns flicker. People gather in a hushed semicircle near the church wall, where a small, stage barely a platform, really has been draped with tattered black cloth. And now you begin to notice them, the puppets, dangling from wires, carved of wood with eerily lifelike eyes. These marionettes do not resemble the cheerful clowns or charming jesters you might expect. Instead, their mouths are twisted into frozen screams. Their costumes are tattered robes. One of them holds what appears to be a bloodied sword. This is not Sesame Street. This is a medieval puppet show and the theme is hell. You watch, equal parts fascinated and unsettled, as the puppet master steps forward, cloaked and hunched, his voice gravelly and theatrical. He begins to chant the opening of the tale. No jokes, no cheerful introductions, just. And then the soul descended into the pit, dragged by its tongue for the lies it spoke. And with that, the show begins. The story? A man who stole bread from a church is tormented by demons, judged by the archangel Michael, and eventually cast into a lake of fire, all portrayed by wooden figures on strings. Flames are mimicked using red cloth and candlelight. The sound of screams is made by the master rubbing a wet cloth against an old drum. A tiny marionette priest holds a scroll in one hand and a torch in the other. The whole scene is both theatrical and terrifying. Believe it or not, this was a common form of entertainment across much of medieval Europe. Puppet shows were not just for children. In fact, many weren't intended for children at all. They were morality placer, visual storytelling method, used to teach the illiterate masses about virtue, sin, and consequence. And they pulled no punches. Puppets were beheaded, set on fire, devoured by dragons, or crushed under the weight of their own sins. Light-hearted fare, clearly. Mainstream historians confirm that puppet theatre was widely used by the church as an educational tool. It helped reinforce sermons in a vivid, unforgettable way. But over time, independent puppet masters emerged travelers who twisted the format into darker, more dramatic, or outright absurd performances. Their shows blurred the line between morality tale and horror story. Some even included humor so black it would make a modern stand-up comic hesitate. One fringe anecdote tells of a puppet troupe in Bohemia that once performed The Passion of the Christ, entirely with rats dressed in tunics. It was reportedly banned halfway through by an outraged bishop, but not before drawing a crowd of over 300 people. Another tale tells of a puppet show reenacting a local murder trial, complete with blood-squirting effects made from pig's bladder and red dye. Tonight's performance continues. The thief puppet begs for mercy. Demons with forked tongues descend upon him, their tiny arms flailing on strings. You glance at the child beside you. He is rapt, wide-eyed, not frightened at all. In fact, he leans in closer when the devil appears, stitched in black with crimson-painted horns and sharp wire teeth. People watch in silence, absorbed. Some clutch rosaries, others sip from flasks. A few exchange amused glances at the more dramatic moments. It's theatre, yes, but also something ritualistic. Everyone here seems to know the rhythm of it, when to gasp, when to mutter prayers under their breath, when to laugh. And then the puppet master switches tone. A new figure appears, a tiny monk bearing a candle. He speaks via falsetto, oddly high for such a solemn character, of redemption, of the power of repentance, and finally banishes the devils. The sinner is raised, cleansed, and placed gently beneath a felt-covered tombstone. The curtain falls. The crowd applauds. It's not rowdy, just steady and sincere. They've seen this show, or something like it, a dozen times, but each version brings new layers, new warnings, new endings. One man leans over to his wife and says, "They used a real bone this time, I swear." She shushes him and wipes a tear. There's an open scholarly debate about just how much influence these puppet shows had on public morality. Some argue they were just distractions, little more than travelling horror shows dressed in virtue. Others insist they served a powerful role, planting seeds of fear or hope in minds too weary for sermons. One medieval bishop wrote, "A puppet's lesson reaches where a priest's voice cannot." Interestingly, many puppet masters kept notebook-scrappy little ledgers full of sketches, notes on crowd reactions, or ideas for improving the gore. Some of these survive today in libraries and private collections, filled with scribbles like, "Add one more scream to devil scene," or "Fire effect too short by longer cloth." In their own strange way, these artists were pioneers of emotional pacing, special effects, and audience engagement. And yes, not all puppet shows were spiritual. Some troupes specialized in bawdy humor, featuring drunk monks, love-struck knights, or sarcastic donkeys who mocked authority figures. One particularly famous show in Florence featured a puppet pope being tricked into kissing a pig's behind. It was banned, revived, banned again, and ultimately turned into a folk legend. Back in your village, the puppet master now lowers his voice and offers the closing lines. "May you live with clean hands and clean hearts, lest strings be tied to your fate." He bows low. A small girl runs forward to give him a coin. Others follow. You realize how many of the audience members are smiling, not laughing, not frightened, just satisfied. Something about the darkness made them feel safer. As the stage is packed away, you help gather the last of the benches. The candlelight flickers across the faces of the departing crowd. Some hum softly. One old man recites a prayer. The children tug their parents' hands, reenacting the screaming puppet thief with wild, flailing arms. And you think how strange, and yet how human, to create figures of wood and string just to make sense of fear, to bring demons into view so they could be defeated, to gather, watch, and pretend, all so the shadows of the real world might feel smaller when the lights went out. In a place with few books, fewer comforts, and 1,000 real dangers, these grotesque little plays weren't just entertainment, they were mirrors, warnings, wishes, and maybe, just maybe, the very first bedtime stories designed to scare you into goodness. By now, your sense of what qualifies as entertainment has been thoroughly redefined. You've seen geese used as sporting equipment, blood treated like soup broth, and puppets screaming in imitation of the damned. But tonight holds something even stranger. As you walk down the damp village road, following a quiet stream of torchlight and murmuring voices, you begin to realize that the next event won't involve actors or jesters. It will involve a trial, but not of a person. No. Tonight's proceedings are dedicated to the solemn legal judgment of a pig. Yes, you heard correctly. A full courtroom trial, complete with a judge, scribes, witnesses, and official legal processal arranged to prosecute an animal. It's not satire, it's not theatre, it is real, by the full measure of medieval law. And in a few moments, you'll be sitting in a makeshift gallery, watching as lawyers debate whether a goat deserves the death penalty. Welcome to the absurdly sincere world of animal trials. Though it sounds like folklore, the medieval records are shockingly clear. Animals could be arrested, charged, and punished for crimes against humans. Most commonly, pigs were put on trial for injuring or killing children. Cows, horses, and dogs occasionally joined the docket. But the strangest cases involved insect mice eating harvests, locusts invading vineyards, and once, in 16th century France, a group of weevils accused of property damage and summoned to appear in court. Tonight's accused is a swine named Marjorie. She stands in a crude wooden pen near the front of the courtroom, really just the village hall with extra candles. Her snout is crusted with mud, and she looks entirely uninterested in the justice system. But the officials take it seriously. The judge, an elderly man with ceremonial robes and an iron-tipped staff, clears his throat, the scribe dips his pen, and the trial begins. The charge: Marjorie allegedly trampled a neighbour's vegetable patch, devoured several rare herbs, and frightened a monk into dropping his relics. The penalty could range from banishment to death, depending on the severity and, frankly, the mood of the jury. Marjorie has a defence attorney. Yes, a real one. He's a nervous young clerk from a neighbouring town who probably expected his legal career to involve fewer pigs and more Latin. He begins with a heartfelt speech about the nature of porcine instinct. The prosecution argues that the pig was clearly aware of her wrongdoing, as evidenced by the fact that she ran away after the incident. You raise your eyebrows. Someone next to you whispers, "Flight is a sign of guilt." As absurd as it all seems, this wasn't unusual. Animal trials were rooted in deep theological and philosophical beliefs. In a world where animals were seen as part of a divine hierarchy, capable of both serving and violating human law, it followed twistedly that they should be held accountable. The church viewed the world through moral absolutes, and when an animal sinned, it threatened not just property or life, but the cosmic order. Some trials went further. There were cases where animals were dressed in clothing to appear more civil. In one trial from 1386 in Falaise, France, a sow accused of killing a child was dressed in human garments before being hanged in the town square. The townspeople watched in eerie silence as the pig swung slowly from the noose, a crude mimicry of human justice. Historians still argue whether these rituals were symbolic or sincerely judicial. Some believe they functioned as communal catharsis, especially when a child or elder had died. It gave people a place to direct their grief and rage. Others think it was a legal tool to settle disputes about ownership and negligence in an era before insurance and civil suits. And, Of course, others believe medieval people just really liked putting things on trial. The trial of Marjorie continues. Witnesses are called. A boy claims he saw her grinning while stomping basil. A woman swears she heard her snort at the priest. The defence counters that pigs cannot form intent, and that Marjorie was merely foraging. The judge nods solemnly. The clerk scribbles furiously. The pig, meanwhile, snores. There's a short recess while the judge confers with local priests about the spiritual implications of porcine trespass. During the break, you chat with a merchant who tells you of a trial he once saw involving a rooster accused of laying an egg, a supposed sign of witchcraft. The bird was found guilty and burned. You should have heard that chicken scream, he says, completely straight-faced. Eventually, the court reconvenes. The judge delivers the verdict with gravity. Marjorie is found guilty, but due to the lack of direct injury and the ambiguity of malice, she is sentenced to public shaming rather than death. Tomorrow, she'll be paraded through the village with a sign reading, "I trespassed and frightened the holy," and then released to a new owner. Everyone claps. You sit back in disbelief. The ceremony, the gravity, the ritual, every bit of it was real. It wasn't mockery or parody. This was medieval jurisprudence in action. And as you walk out with the other spectators, you realize that for the villagers, the trial served more than one purpose. It was justice, yes. But it was also narrative. It gave meaning to chaos, logic to loss. When something bad happened, the community could gather, point at a pig, and say, "There, that's what went wrong." As the night deepens, you pass a group of children reenacting the trial with sticks and a potato. One is pretending to be the judge. Another squeals dramatically as the pig. The others laugh. And suddenly it all clicks. In a world where wolves could kill your flock, where illness struck without warning, and where loss was constant, being able to explain a tragedy even absurdly was a kind of comfort. The pig isn't just a scapegoat. It's a stand-in for everything uncontrollable. And maybe, in its own twisted way, this made sense. The courtroom offered ritual. The performance gave structure. The punishment, even when levied against an animal, helped restore order. And for a community with few diversions, it was also somehow entertainment. You'd scoff, but let's be honest. You stayed for the whole trial, didn't you? The trial of the pig lingers in your thoughts as you wander back toward the village square, torchlight flickering against the cobbled walls. You're no longer surprised by what passes for amusement in this world, only intrigued by how elaborate it all is. The legal theatrics of swine gave way to whispered conversations, and those whispers have led you here, to a small, raucous gathering near the bakery. The smell of yeast and burnt crust mingles with tension in the air. Someone is drawing a circle in the dirt with a stick. A crowd forms. And then, without warning, the battle begins not with fists or swords, but with words. This is a medieval insult contest. You think of rap battles today, fierce, rhythmic, poetic smackdowns, but this is rawer, less polished, and somehow far more personal. Two men step forward. They remove their hats, bow deeply, and begin to hurl deeply creative, strangely specific, and hilariously cruel insults at one another. The rules are simple. No touching, no repetition, and no retreat. Once you're in the circle, you fight with metaphors, jabs, and sometimes rhymed couplets if you're feeling fancy. The winner is decided by audience applauser, the other guy crying. The first insult is thrown like a rotten apple. Thy breath doth curdle wine, and thy mother hath elbows like rotted parsnips. The crowd erupts, not in outrage, but in laughter. The second man replies, Thou art the reason sheep fear shadows, and no stew has ever welcomed thy spoon. It's a bizarre mix of rural imagery and unfiltered shade, and the audience loves it. In the Middle Ages, these contests were sometimes formalized into flyting, a ritualized exchange of verbal abuse. Originating in Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions, flyting was often poetic, structured, and even performed before royal courts. But the street version, the one you're watching now, was messier and more grounded in the earthy humour of everyday folk. And don't assume it was only men who competed. Women flighters were known to flay their opponents with words so sharp they were banned from markets for fear of starting fights. One fringe account from 13th century Ireland details a nun named Moira, who won a flighting contest by comparing her opponent's haircut to a scourged sheep's backside. She was later promoted to abbess, possibly unrelated. Historians still debate whether her victory influenced monastic policy or merely local fashion trends. Back in the square, two new challengers take the stage. This pair is more theatrical. One enters with a goose feather tucked behind his ear and a limp he clearly doesn't need. He delivers his first blow. I have seen finer faces on scarecrows and heard nobler thoughts from barn walls. His rival claps slowly and responds, "If wit were ale, thou wouldst still be dry after a flood." Gasps ripple through the crowd. Someone pretends to faint. A small boy starts repeating the insult to his sister, who immediately punches him in the arm. But the real art of these contests isn't just the language, it's the delivery. A good flighter has posture, rhythm, and timing. Here she knows when to pause, how to raise an eyebrow just so, how to gesture like they're conducting an invisible orchestra of shame. You watch an older woman take the circle now, straight-backed and calm. Her voice is low and lethal. "I once mistook thee for a lopsided goat, but upon closer hearing, the goat was more eloquent." Her opponent, red-faced and stammering, tries to reply but only manages, "Well, thou stinketh." It's over before it began. The crowd cheers her name. What's surprising isn't the cruelty of the language, but the joy. These people want to be insulted, to play the fool. It's a game, a ritual, and a release valve for a society with precious few ways to express emotion safely. In a world where real violence is always one bad day away, a verbal duel lets people throw fire without drawing blood. There's even a small booth nearby where an old man sells insult starter scrolls, parchments with ready-made phrases like, "Thou unwashed fig basket," and "May lice find comfort in thy linens." You flip through one. Some of the lines are actually poetic, oddly elegant. You wonder how much of this language was passed down, mutated, and ultimately ended up in Shakespeare plays. Indeed, mainstream historians recognize flighting as one of the ancestral roots of modern poetry, slams, and battle rap. The structure of insult response, the rhythm of phrasing, the crowd's judgment, it's all still with us, just set to different beats. And just like then, the real prize isn't coin or title, it's reputation. It's knowing your words made the crowd roar. As the final duel of the night begins, the energy peaks. The two best flighters of the village square off. One is a wiry man with soot-stained fingers and a huge grin. The other, an elegant tailor with gold-threaded cuffs, clearly used to high company. Their battle is fierce and fast, laced with wordplay, accusations of bedwetting, and references to questionable soup recipes. You laugh aloud when one shouts, "Thy presence would spoil honey, and even ghosts flee thy conversation." And then it ends. No clear winner, just two sweaty, grinning men bowing to thunderous applause. A few coins are tossed. A jug of cider is passed. The tension breaks. People mingle, share favourites, repeat their favourite lines to each other. Children run up, mimicking the insults, making up new ones like, "Ye cabbage-toed donkey knitter." One woman pats her husband's arm and says, "Thou art the reason stew boils slower." He looks oddly proud. You sit on a barrel at the edge of the square, the sound of laughter echoing in the cool night air. Somehow, insulting each other brought these people closer. No fists, no bitterness, just bruised egos and proud wordsmiths. You think of modern times, of comedy roasts and internet flame wars, and wonder if the medieval villagers weren't ahead of their time. They created a world where conflict could be absurd, performance could be personal, and humour could be a public spectacle. The fire dies down. The crowd begins to drift toward their homes, still chuckling and whispering insults under their breath. One last flighter, drunk and inspired, leans into a goat and mutters, "Even thou wouldst make finer company than Edgar." The goat sneezes. And with that, the night closes on one of the strangest forms of medieval amusementa, battle of minds, wits, and wonderfully rude metaphors. In a time without television, libraries, or late-night talk shows, the medieval world still found a way to turn insult into art. The moon climbs high over the village, casting a pale glow across rooftops and lantern-lit paths. Just when you think the evening's entertainments have run their course, a ripple of murmurs spreads through the street. People are lighting candle slots of them. Others begin singing low hymns, the kind that sound more like chants than melodies. You follow the flickering procession until you reach the churchyard, where the villagers have gathered around a wide path lined with flower petals and flickering lamps. The air smells of beeswax and incense. But this is no vigil. and no holiday mass. This is something else entirely. This is a naked religious parade. Yes, naked, as in intentionally unclothed, but not in the way you might expect, and not for any lewd reason. In the medieval world, nudity, particularly public nudity, sometimes served as a form of spiritual devotion. You're about to witness one of the strangest rituals of penance known to history. The crowd parts as a group of penitents begins their slow march down the path. Most of them are men, but a few women are among them too, draped in translucent linen that offers little protection from the cool night air. Their bodies are daubed with ashes. Their heads are bowed. Some hold crosses. Others drag small chains behind them. A bell chimes softly. There's no laughter, no shouting, just the eerie hum of voices in unison, and the sound of bare feet padding along cobbled stones. This is a flagellant procession. Such rituals emerge during times of crisis, especially during plague years or famines when people believed that only extreme public repentance could save their communities from divine wrath. Flagellants would walk from village to village, whipping themselves with knotted cords, chanting hymns, and begging forgiveness for the sins of humanity. In some cases, they were fully clothed. But in others, particularly during periods of religious fervour, they stripped bare as a symbol of humility and vulnerability before God. Tonight's procession is more modest than some chronicled in history. No one is bleeding yet, but you see the cords in their hands, the streaks of red already forming across a few backs. It's unsettling and solemn, a theatre of suffering meant to invoke a weaned, perhaps guilt in those who watch. Mainstream historians agree that while the Church initially tolerated these movements, especially during the height of the Black Death, they eventually turned against them. The unregulated processions, the harsh self-punishment, and the tendency of some groups to claim prophetic authority made the clergy nervous. Several popes issued edicts banning unsanctioned flagellation, but the practice endured for centuries, popping up in waves whenever catastrophe struck. There's debate over whether these rituals served a deeper psychological purpose. Some scholars argue that the intense emotional release offered by physical pain, especially in public, acted as a coping mechanism. In a world with no therapy, no medicine for trauma, and no explanations for why terrible things happened, walking naked and bleeding through the village might have felt like a way to do something, anything, to reclaim a sense of control. Tonight, the procession continues in silence. One of the penitents drops to his knees mid-march and begins to whip his shoulders with slow, deliberate strokes. The lashes aren't wild, they're rhythmic, like prayer. A child nearby hides behind her mother's cloak. An older man crosses himself and murmurs a blessing. No one speaks above a whisper. Even the wind seems to quiet. And then, a voice breaks the silence. A woman in the parade begins to sing not a hymn, but a soft lullaby. It's haunting, like something you'd sing to calm a ghost. The others join in. Their steps slow even more, and suddenly the line of bodies feels less like a ritual and more like a dream, fragile, raw, and surreal. You spot a monk nearby, watching carefully. He doesn't join, but neither does he condemn. This, you realize, is a tolerated deviation. Not entirely approved by the Church, but not condemned either. The community needs this, especially after what they've lost to sickness, storms, or war. These displays might make little sense by theological standards, but emotionally, they bind people together. One peculiar detail catches your attention. A man near the front of the line wears a crown made of thorns and carries a wooden yoke across his shoulders. This is no random act. He's reenacting the Passion of Christ in miniature, casting himself as a human reminder of divine suffering. A fringe account from the 15th century describes a similar man who walked over 200 miles in such fashion, stopping only to preach about repentance and distribute bread. Some saw him as a saint. Others called him mad. He disappeared after a thunderstorm, and no one knows what became of him. Back in the present, the procession reaches the church doors. The parish priest steps forward, holding a chalice of water. He sprinkles it lightly over the penitents. Not quite a baptism, more of a blessing. The singing fades. The bodies stop. One by one, the participants are given blankets and led inside for warmth. There is no applause, no celebration, just a quiet dispersal. And yet, the crowd lingers. Some begin discussing what they've seen, who bled the most, who sang the softest, who might be doing this again next week. Others are more skeptical. Fools, mutters a baker nearby. thinking God hears better when you're cold and naked. Still, even he doesn't walk away. Not yet. You're left pondering the spectacle. Was it performance? Was it worship? Was it both? It's easy to dismiss it as medieval excess, but the emotion in the air was real. There was pain, yes, but also beauty. A strange sort of solidarity formed not in celebration but in shared desperation. A need to believe that suffering might somehow earn salvation, or at least bring meaning to a world that so often feels indifferent. As the crowd disperses, you overhear two women talking about joining the next walk. One says she's tired of grieving silently, the other simply nods. You realize then that for many, these public rituals aren't about punishment, they're about making sorrow visible, about saying, "Look, I'm hurting too." You walk away slowly, the chill of the night pressing into your bones, the smell of wax and ash trailing behind you. The image of that line of quiet, wounded figures will follow you for a long time, and in a strange way, you understand now why people watched, why they gathered, why they didn't turn away. Because even the strangest forms of entertainment in the medieval world weren't just distractions, they were mirrors, prayers, and sometimes cries for help wrapped in ritual. The sun rises slowly the next morning, casting golden streaks across rooftops still slick with dew. Roosters crow in the distance, dogs stretch and yawn beside doorsteps, and the baker's chimney puffs its first coils of flower-scented smoke into the air. You think, surely today will be quiet. After a night of ash-streaked penitence and bloodied backs, maybe the villagers will take a break from their endless pursuit of bizarre amusement. But no, before the sun even clears the treetops, a boy runs past you yelling, "Feast at the Lord Mayor's, and he's bringing the fart jester." You blink. Surely you misheard. But no, a nearby man chuckles and explains, "Aye, it's the fool from the next county, one who plays his backside like a drum. Best one in years." He walks off shaking his head, equal parts bewildered and impressed. So you follow the sounds of laughter and the tantalizing smell of roasted meat toward what might be the most irreverent, ridiculous celebration yet. Welcome to the Feast of Fools, an event where flatulence, absurdity, and crude jokes take center stage. The feast is already underway in the town square, which has been hastily transformed into a banquet arena. Long wooden tables are crowded with trenches-thick slabs of bread, used as plate sheeped with steaming pork, boiled cabbage, turnip mash, and gravy that looks suspiciously congealed. Jugs of ale are passed hand to hand, and villagers greet each other with slurred blessings and suspiciously rehearsed burps. At the center of it all, standing atop an overturned wine barrel, is a man dressed in bright patchwork and bells. He wears a jester's hat that flops with every exaggerated gesture. He's panting slightly, arms akimbo, and then he bows, lifts one leg, and lets out a triumphant, trumpet-like fart. The crowd erupts. This is Roland, known far and wide as a professional farter. And no, that's not a modern insult. It was a genuine form of medieval entertainment. Certain jesters specialized in bodily humor, particularly flatulence, and some were celebrated for their precision, volume, and musicality. The most famous of all was Roland le Petomane, though records suggest that many towns had their own fart champions. Roland here is a master of his craft. He doesn't just break wind, he performs. He belts out rhythms-quick double bursts followed by slow, whiny whimpers. He tells jokes mid-performance, comparing villagers' names to the sounds he makes. And this one, he says, squatting slightly, is for Gregory the blacksmith, sharp and hot. The crowd howls. The Feast of Fools, and its many local variants, was more than just a dinner party. It was a topsy-turvy day of role reversal and indulgence, where everything sacred became profane, and everything profane was celebrated with open arms. Nobles played peasants, priests were mocked with impunity, servants gave orders, and everyone feasted until they couldn't see straight. These celebrations, often held around the New Year or during carnival seasons, were rooted in ancient customs and irreverent joy. Mainstream historians suggest that these festivals served a critical social function. They offered temporary relief from the rigid hierarchies of medieval life. One day a year, the poor could mock the powerful, and the absurd could reign supreme. It was chaotic, yes, but also strangely healthy. The system stayed intact because, now and then, it was allowed to bend. One fringe tale from 14th century Italy describes a fart jester who was knighted for making the Pope laugh so hard he dropped his chalice. The tale is almost certainly exaggerated, but the very fact that it might have happened tells you a lot about how deeply humour, even the crude kind, was woven into the medieval psyche. Back at the feast, the tables are now hosting informal contests. One man claims he can recite a psalm while burping every third word. Another woman begins an impromptu stand-up routine, pretending to be a duchess ordering peasants to massage her pig. Children run around with chamber pots on their heads, pretending to be knights. Someone starts playing music with spoons and a barrel lid. And then comes the highlight of the day, the joke duel. 2 volunteers are given chairs, a drum roll of pots, and 3 rounds to tell the funniest, dirtiest, almost absurd joke they can muster. The catch? If the crowd boos, they must eat a spoonful of pickled eel brine. The first man opens with a riddle involving goats, underpants, and a bishop's shoe. The second simply lifts his tunic and makes a face. The crowd loses it. Eel brine is consumed. Victory is declared. It's all astonishingly crude, but no one is offended. Because here, for a short while, shame doesn't exist. Laughter takes the place of judgment. And bodily humour, so often scorned in formal spaces, is given free rein. You glance around and notice that even the village priest is here, albeit standing stiffly near the edge of the crowd. He smiles begrudgingly when someone offers him a meat pie in the shape of a bishop's hat. Moments later, 2 drunk farmers perform a clumsy reenactment of a sacred ritual, replacing holy water with ale and crossing themselves with sausages. The priest sighs deeply, but does not interfere. There's debate among scholars about just how much the church tolerated these events. Some festivals, like the Feast of the Ass or the Feast of the Donkey, were explicitly church, sanctioned parodies meant to amuse and instruct, but others walked the line between satire and heresy. Still, these moments of irreverence were often allowed because they were brief, local, and cathartic. Better to let people laugh once a year than to risk revolt from constant repression. Back at the square, the final act of the feast approaches. A huge cake easily the size of a small doggie's unveiled. Hidden inside is a dried bean. Whoever finds the bean in their slice is declared the king of fools for the rest of the day. They get to issue silly commands, wear a tin crown, and be carried through the streets on a wheelbarrow. It's a tradition that dates back centuries, rooted in both pagan winter rites and Christian Epiphany customs. And though the title carries no real power, you can see how seriously everyone takes it. The bean is found by a child with sauce on her chin and no front teeth. She beams as the villagers cheer. Her first command? Everyone must bark like dogs until I say stop. And they do. Grown men, grandmothers, even Roland the fart gestural down on their hands and knees, barking like hounds in the freezing mud. The girl squeals with delight. You sit back, watching this absurd pageant unfold, and it hits you this isn't just nonsense. It's deliberate, communal, and deeply human. In a world bound by rules, superstition, hunger, and hard labour, these wild moments of release are essential. They remind people that laughter is still possible, that no matter how hard life gets, joy doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to be shared. The sun dips low again, painting the sky in streaks of amber and charcoal, but the energy in the village hasn't faded, it's only transformed. The laughter from the Feast of Fools now gives way to an entirely different kind of spectacle. You follow a stream of villagers toward the open field beyond the town walls, where wagons are being unloaded and voices call out instructions. Wooden props, painted backdrops, and bundles of costumes are being hoisted into place. A makeshift stage rises, and already a crowd is gathering around it with expectant faces. Tonight, it seems, is reserved for one of the grandest forms of medieval fun, the mystery play. But don't let the name fool you. These weren't mysteries in the modern detective story sense. They were religious dramas, theatrical retellings of stories from the Bible. But if you're expecting quiet hymns and solemn narration, you're in for a surprise. These plays could be raucous, dramatic, unexpectedly funny, and most astonishingly packed with special effects. Sometimes very bad ones, sometimes dangerously good. The troupe tonight is performing the harrowing of hell, the part of Christian legend, where Christ descends to the underworld after the crucifixion and frees the souls of the righteous. It's a favourite subject for medieval theatre, full of fire, demons, angels, and dramatic declarations, and the villagers love it. You settle into the grass as the play begins. The actors wear robes stitched from old curtains, their wings made of chicken feathers and waxed linen. The devil appears, first draped in soot-streaked red, horns made of twisted leather, and eyes wide with theatrical madness. He paces the stage, monologuing about the souls he's trapped and the chaos he commands. It's over the top, in the best possible way. Then, with a flourish and a shouted, "Repent, ye damned!" Christ appears, flanked by angels holding golden paper halos, and is that a smoke machine? No kite. One of the crew is crouched behind the stage, feeding sulphur and damp straw into a brazier. The smoke wafts up in thick, noxious plumes. The crowd gasps and cheers. This is high budget by medieval standards. Mainstream historians note that mystery plays were a cornerstone of late medieval entertainment, especially in towns with strong guild systems. The plays were often organized by trade. Guildsbakers might perform the Last Supper, carpenters the Crucifixion, and coopers the Flood. It was both civic pride and public devotion, but it was also fiercely competitive. Towns would try to outdo one another with increasingly elaborate props, costumes, and effects. The fringe comes in the form of the pyrotechnics. You watch in amazement as the devil's henchman-impish figures in soot-covered tunic set off what appears to be a miniature explosion at the foot of the stage. A puff of flour ignites over an open flame, sending a burst of light and ash into the air. The audience erupts in applause. A small child bursts into tears. A chicken runs across the stage, unplanned but wildly appropriate. In one infamous performance from Coventry in the 15th century, the devil was reportedly flown onto the stage using ropes and pulleys. The system failed, of course, and the actor crashed into the bishop's seat, fracturing both the prop throne and his dignity. Tonight's troupe seems aware of those dangers. The only thing flying is a hand-painted bat, nailed to a stick, waved enthusiastically during the underworld scenes. The story unfolds with dramatic flair. Sinners wail, angels shout blessings. The devil glares and shakes his fists, vowing vengeance. But the audience doesn't just watch, they participate. Children hiss at the demons. Women cheer for the angels. One man starts chanting, "Burn him," during a particularly intense confrontation between good and evil. Someone else throws a cabbage. It hits a demon square in the head. Despite the biblical subject matter, mystery plays weren't afraid to incorporate comedy. In tonight's show, one of the damned souls is a drunkard who insists on bringing his ale cup into heaven. Another claims he only sinned because the fish on Fridays was terrible. The crowd roars with laughter. You realize that even in their sacred narratives, the medieval villagers found room for themselves, for their flaws, their hunger, their petty complaints. It makes the story feel real, alive. One curious moment occurs during the climactic battle. A massive wooden dragon head is wheeled onto the stage. It's clearly a two-person jawbone, controls the mouth, the other the smoke pipe. But something goes wrong. The smoke backfires. A puff of embers flies into the hay bale by the stage's edge. Panic ripples through the crew. A man rushes forward with a bucket. For a moment, you think the whole production might end in flames. But they recover. The fire is smothered. The crowd cheers. An actor improvises, "Hell doth flare, but heaven prevails." The line wasn't in the script, but it earns the loudest applause of the night. And that's the thing. These plays weren't polished productions. They were messy, chaotic, and wonderfully human. The line between actor and audience blurred constantly. If a prop broke, someone joked about it. If a line was forgotten, a priest might shout the correct verse from the front row. You think of modern theatre with its perfect lighting and silent crowds, and you realize this is something else entirely less refined, perhaps, but more alive. Historians still debate the origin of the most theatrical elements. Some argue the spectacle was meant to inspire fear-showing hell as a literal place of fire and agony to encourage moral behavior. Others see it as entertainment first, theology second. Either way, the mystery play was one of the few places where the sacred and the silly could sit side by side, where demons wore bells, saints tripped over robes, and audiences wept and laughed in the same hour. As the final scene unfolds, Christ leading the souls to light, devils howling in defeat, angels scattering rose petals, the crowd rises to its feet. The actors bow. A goat wanders across the stage and is adopted immediately into the cast. Someone tosses coins. Someone else sings. The joy is complete. You sit back, your legs sore, your hands dusty from clapping, and you feel it, the strange, warm satisfaction of having witnessed something ancient and ridiculous and holy all at once. In a world without movie theatres, opera houses, or concert halls, this was what people had, and they made it count. The crowd begins to disperse slowly, still buzzing with energy. Children repeat lines from the play. Old men debate whether the dragon head was better this year than last. A woman wipes a tear from her cheek and says she always cries when the gates of heaven open. Someone else jokes that the devil stole the show. And you? You walk away knowing that you've seen not just a performance, but a glimpse into the heart of medieval joy. A joy that welcomed chaos, that embraced failure, that celebrated noise and faith and flames all tangled together. The stars are out in full now, dusting the black velvet sky with pinpricks of light. You follow the sound of fiddles and the thump of a hollow drum back into the heart of the village. The square, by some miracle, has been cleaned well, mostly. The fire's been rekindled, bread is passed around again, and someone is wearing a bishop's mitre made of cabbages. You don't even question it anymore. Tonight, it's time for the final and perhaps most unhinged celebration of the medieval calendar, the Feast of Reversals, mock coronations, and total social upheaval. Tonight is the realm of mock kings, donkey bishops, and backward days. You arrive just in time to see the newly crowned Lord of Misrule, perched on a barrel throne, barking orders through a wooden spoon as if it were a royal scepter. He's 14, covered in soot, and absolutely drunk on the power of his temporary title. To his left, the village blacksmith wears a frilly bonnet and plays the lute terribly. To his right, the midwife has been declared the official military strategist and is drawing battle maps in mud. The crowd obeys all instructions with serious, dramatic exaggeration, and it's glorious. This is not chaos. This is sanctioned chaos. The medieval world had few outlets for rebellion, so once or twice a year, it built rebellion right into the schedule. These festivals had many names: the Feast of Fools, the Feast of the Ass, the Festival of the Boy Bishop, but all shared the same logic: turn everything upside down. Priests became jesters, peasants became kings, customs were mocked, traditions twisted, the absurd became holy, the holy became absurd. The origins are murky. Some trace the custom back to Roman Saturnalia, when masters served slaves and games ruled the streets. Others point to ancient agricultural rites celebrating seasonal transitions. Either way, the church reluctantly inherited the tradition and tried to shape it often unsuccessfully into something that looked like religious observance. It never really worked. The people always took it further. Tonight's festivities begin with the election of the donkey bishop, a real donkey, dressed in embroidered cloth, led solemnly through the town and into the church, where the animal is allowed to bray loudly during the sermon. The congregation joins in. For one glorious, ridiculous moment, the donkey has the pulpit, and no one minds. Then comes the backwards procession. Villagers march in reverse through the square, wearing clothes inside out, shoes on the wrong feet, speaking gibberish Latin phrases that parody actual mass. Pax vobiscum becomes snacks gobble crumb, and no one dares correct them. The laughter is deep and full-bodied, not cruel but warm. Everyone is in on the joke. You find yourself drafted into the role of Royal Torchbearer Third Class, which mostly involves holding a damp candle and being scolded theatrically by a 6-year-old in a fake mustache. You accept your fate. The crowd roars approval. Historians still argue about the purpose of these inversions. Was it harmless fun or dangerous release? A way to let people poke fun at authority so they wouldn't revolt for real, or a chance to experience other roles, other powers, even if only briefly. Some suggest that medieval people understood the need to laugh at their own structures, that humour was a kind of resilience. One especially bizarre variant of this celebration was the boy bishop tradition. In cathedrals across England and France, a young choir boy would be elected to rule the cathedral for a few days around the feast of St. Nicholas. He'd wear the bishop's robes, give mock sermons, and lead processions. In some towns, he even issued edicts: all fish must wear hats, or sermons must be sung to the tune of barnyard noises. The clergy watched with tight smiles. The people loved it. You notice, as tonight unfolds, that the lines between performance and sincerity blur constantly. When the boy king declares that all nobles must sing pig songs, a merchant's wife belts out a squeal that's more convincing than it should be. When the donkey bishop trips over its velvet stole, half the village kneels in faux reverence. There's no script, no real direction, just momentum, and somehow it all works. In one corner, a group performs backwards prayers lines from Mass recited in reverse order, not blasphemously but comedically. The chant drones on, Amen, Spirits holy, thou praise we. A mock monk throws flower petals and flirts with every passing goose. Children form a tribunal and convict their parents of excessive bedtime enforcement. A man in a chamber pot crown demands taxes in the form of pie crusts. You sit with an older woman who watches it all with folded arms and a knowing smile. It keeps the world from cracking, she says, nodding at the foolishness. We laugh now so we can survive later. And just like that, the meaning of the evening clicks into place. Because this isn't just about fun, it's about release, about allowing the unbearable seriousness of life plagues, famines, taxes, death to be mocked, if only for one night. About letting the powerless pretend, the powerful be humbled, and the whole world turn on its head for a few hours. It's an act of communal alchemy, sorrow into laughter, order into absurdity, darkness into shared candlelight. One final ritual remains. The night ends with a reverse coronation, where the mock king is symbolically dethroned. The villagers gather in a circle, strip him of his cabbage crown, and solemnly thank him for his foolish service. He bows, they cheer, and then they place the crown on a turnip, which is gently carried away and planted in the garden behind the tavern. Why? No one remembers. But it's tradition, and that's enough. You watch as the crowd slowly drifts apart, peeling off toward home in clumps of tired laughter and wine-fueled reflection. Costumes are folded, candles snuffed. Someone sings a final lullaby that hangs in the air like wood smoke. The boy king, now just a boy again, yawns and curls up near a barrel. His reign has ended. The world is right side up again. And you, who have walked through frog ballets, pig trials, fart feasts, and puppet hellscapes, realize something you didn't expect. These people weren't strange for the sake of being strange. They were creating meaning. Through ridiculous traditions, vulgar jokes, theatrical absurdity, they kept despair at bay. They carved out joy wherever they could draw, unfiltered and fiercely communal. You walk back to your resting place under the stars, heart full of strange memories and unexpected tenderness. You came to witness medieval entertainment. You leave having seen something deeper. Survival through spectacle, hope through hilarity, humanity, bizarre and brilliant, painted in cabbage crowns and donkey sermons. And now, as the village fades into stillness, and the last candle gutters in a breeze that smells faintly of wood smoke and roasted onions, you close your eyes beneath the vast velvet sky. The echoes of laughter, hooves, bells, and lute strings seem to swirl just at the edge of hearing. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then falls silent. Somewhere, a child mumbles half a line from the mystery play in their sleep. The chaos is over. The donkey bishop has been tucked into his stable. The fart jester snores beside an empty flagon. Even the frog ballet troupe has packed up their crates and wandered off into the dark. The world tilted sideways by mock coronations, feathered insults, and cabbage crown showers returned to its natural quiet tilt. For now, you feel it in your bones, that rare blend of exhaustion and contentment that only comes from being part of something completely ridiculous and, somehow, deeply real. These people, strange, spirited, beautifully human, taught you that fun doesn't always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like absurdity, like survival painted in strange colors, like finding a reason to laugh when the world gives you none. So let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift back to that moment when the crowd gasped at the exploding dragon head or howled at a burping bishop. Let it fade, gently. The madness has passed. The torches are out. All that remains is the warmth it left behind. You're safe. You're here. And tomorrow is just another day, blessedly upright, until the next festival turns the world upside down again. Good night.